questions. Otherwise, Laura, you have an hour. Go ahead and get started.
Okay, so first of all, thanks for the invitation. It's really good to be here. So let me just, as a caveat, add, this is my job market paper. It's been there for a while. I'm actively working on it. So it's a great time for all your feedback, comments. At the same time, I was hoping to have ready some results that I haven't had time to just put together in slides and, well, basically collect from my computer. I'll tell you about them though as we go through. So the title kind of gives away a little bit of what I will be talking about, but essentially the paper revisits kind of a very classical question in international macro. How does the macroeconomy adjust to a large external shock under fixed versus flexible exchange rates? But hopefully providing a new angle to the debate, which is going to be the role of firm dynamics. And let me just start by providing a little bit of evidence, or more than evidence, some motivation as to why do I think it's worth to going back to what some people would consider a very old and settled question. So as I was saying, like the focus is going to be on sudden stops, which are just defined as a particular kind of balance of payment prices. The definition I'm going to go with is just the abrupt, unexpected fall in net capital inflows. Most specifically, the literature on sudden stops, which kind of was extremely popular in the early 2000s, has established empirically and then tried to rationalize theoretically a number of stylized facts. So these are things like current account reversals, asset price corrections, types of output contractions, and stuff like that. The one fact that I'm going to be exploring, or I'm going to be focusing on, is the contraction in, or the decline in some measure of productivity. So the picture that you see here, like I would like to focus first on what you see to your left, which is, you know, a standard case study, event study result that you would see many of the sudden stops paper that were written around the 2000s. Is the idea that, you know, if we were to measure TFP in some very rough measure, here is the aggregate solid residual, and you were going to plot it against time. This is a window of 2 years before the sudden stop where the first vertical line appears. So time zero here is sometimes a little bit confusing. This is when the sudden stop actually hits. And then it goes like 4 years later. And what you kind of, the takeaway here would be that, you know, on impact, and by the time the sudden stop has finished, there's a clear decline in some measure of TFP, choose whatever you want, if you compare it to some previous trend. And this has been kind of documenting and assumed to be a stylized fact for most of the literature. What I think is a little bit more surprising is that we now have a new set of sudden stop episodes. And I'm thinking about, you know, the reversal of capital inflows that happened during the sovereign debt crisis in Europe, in the periphery countries. So think about Spain, Italy, Portugal, Ireland. And I was, when I wanted to kind of recreate the same picture for those economies and look at how did TFP behave in those episodes, what I find is that, again, controlling for the trend, the pre-trend, we see that there's no such decline in productivity. So I found this like a pretty surprising fact, especially given how bad these economies were doing. And the first question that kind of jumped into my eyes was whether the fact that these economies were all part of a currency union and therefore had a different type of adjustment in terms of prices or wages instead of the nominal exchange rate has something to do with the fact that productivity did not fall by as much as in the standard cases. So that this kind of gives me the starting point of the paper, which is trying to explore what is the relationship between sudden stops, productivity, and the exchange rate. So what do I do in the paper? I see the paper essentially as having 3 parts. In the first part, I try to deal with the fact that, you know, aggregate productivity is a very black boxy measure. We know it's subject to a lot of compositional issues. And what I try, like the way I try to overcome this is by resorting to firm level data. So ideally, I would like to have, you know, a set of economies that have experienced sudden stops under different regimes. For those of you that have worked with firm level data, you know that like data accessibility is pretty limited. So the best I can do is try to look at two sudden stop episodes under 2 regimes that could work as a case study. And that's exactly what I do by looking at 2 sudden stops that have happened in Spain. The later one corresponds to the European sovereign debt crisis, and I'm going to compare that with an early episode at the beginning of the 90s during the exchange rate mechanism crisis. And I'll describe a little bit more of the context when I get to the data. But the idea here is that I'm going to be able to focus on the compositional side of productivity. I'm going to be looking at firm dynamics, firm entry, and particularly firm exit patterns. And what I'll find is that, the increase in aggregate productivity that Spain experienced, at least in measured terms, in the recent crisis, is not because firms are becoming more productive, which would be extremely surprising. It is because we have a reallocation effect of the massive exit of unproductive firms, and then partial reallocation of this freed up resources to more productive survivors. So this is just another way of saying, like, if you go back to Caballeros and Amour's description of a cleansing effect of a recession, what Spain experienced effectively is a cleansing effect of a sudden stop. Admittedly, there's a number of dimensions along which these two episodes differ. It's true that it's the same country. Like, to some extent, the economic structure of the economy is relatively similar, but there's a number of things that are different just because of the time dimension. Some of them I will be able to partly address. I'll show you in a second how. Some of them, there's nothing much I can do, and I'll just be open about it. However, the rest of the paper is going to be exploring, it's going to be devoted to exploring one of the possible explanations that kind of stands out, which is the fact that exchange rate policy was very different across these two different episodes. So basically, the second part of the paper, what I do is I propose a theoretical framework that's going to be incorporating firm dynamics and into a small open economy DSG model with nominal rigidities. And the reason I'm going to be talking about nominal rigidities is because I want to talk about policy. This kind of setting is going to be able to generate these entry and exit patterns that I document in the firm level data. And also, importantly, the difference in the aggregate productivity behavior. And let me just be clear here, just to correctly manage the expectations. This is not going to be a paper that explains why, in most cases, aggregate TFP falls during a sudden stop. I'm going to take that as a starting point. I'm going to follow, in a reduced form way, what the previous literature has been kind of proposing as to why this is the case. And what I'm going to be trying to get at is, why is it different, or what is different in those cases in which we don't observe such a decline? So I'm interested in the difference. I'm not going to be interested in the decline in TFP that we observe in most flexible regimes. The story that I'm going to tell you, or the mechanism, is that, when you have nominal exchange rates and a country is forced by this capital outflows, when a country is forced to improve competitiveness, the wage level, and I'm thinking about the nominal wage here, is going to have to fall by much more. And to the extent to which, like, consumers or labor suppliers, this also means there's going to be a larger contraction in labor income. And this, through weaker demand, is going to translate into a larger hit in firm profitability. And this is the hit that's going to force the unproductive firms out of the market. So that's the story that I'm going to try to convey through the model. I'm going to kind of do it in two steps. The first one is a first percent. I would love to say a simpler version, but to be honest, it's still pretty stylized, but at least it's a simpler version of the final model where I can deliver, some closed form solutions, and I could kind of pin and build some intuition of the mechanism that I had in the model. And then the second part would be like taking the model to the data, so doing something more on the quantitative side. This, of course, has like three different steps. This is like, the first thing is I want to be very careful in matching the firm level aspects of the data. I'm going to be very much focusing on firm dynamics, so making sure that I get the distributional effects right is going to be very important. And then with this calibrated or estimated model, I can then simulate the most recent episode in Spain and show that, the firm level variables and the aggregate variables actually fall in line with what we observe in the empirical episode. What can I use the model for? Then I can go and test the counterfactual. What would have Spain look like if, instead of being part of the euro and then had their nominal exchange rate fixed to its major trading partners, what if they had been able to depreciate nominally? What if flexible exchange rates had been prevalent? And I can like, by the end of the paper, which is still not here, I'll be able to show you that it actually looks very similar to what happened in the initial episode in the 1992-93. So this is where I'm currently working. I'm not going to be able to give you like the fully estimated quantitative model. Instead, I'm going to go through like a numerical exercise, which is a much simpler version of this quantitative model that at least proves that, you know, the analytical results hold more generally. And then also that, you know, we're getting the aggregate dimension right in the while having the firm level patterns moving in the right direction and not too much off in terms of economic magnitudes. There is a third part of the paper, which I most likely won't be able to cover, but if someone's interested, I'm very happy to talk about it either in the discussion time, but also after the seminar. And this is just showing that, you know, the predictions of the model, at least the aggregate predictions, are going to hold for a wider set of economies. How am I going to do that? Well, this is essentially, I'm going to be repeating the event studies that most of the empirical sudden stop papers tend to include. And I'm going to, once that is showed that this still holds, once you include, you update the number of countries and the number of episodes to the most recent ones, then I'm going to repeat the exercise by binning episodes by exchange rate regime, not only looking at, you know, currency unions and floaters, which are the two extremes. I'm going to look at the regimes in the intermediate, you know, hard pegs, soft pegs, to show that, you know, the more flexibility there is in the exchange rate, and you can think of this as the mapping between the real exchange rate and the nominal exchange rate, the more these two things move together, the more we observe a decline in productivity. So that's kind of the major prediction of the model. There's a second one that has to do with the mechanism that I was describing in terms of demand. We see that, you know, the more you observe this declining productivity, the more the reversal in the current account has to do with exports relative to imports. So we do observe this again holds in a wider set of economies and not only in the Spanish case, which I'm looking at as a case study. So that's Can
I just ask a quick question about the motivating facts on, go back the previous slide? I mean, is this like the universe of sudden stops under floating and the universe of sudden stops under currency unions? I just don't have a good sense of, you know, does these currency union episodes include also developing countries, and you know, is this all about the sort of Great Recession, sudden stops looking different? You know, I don't have a good sense from this.
So this is a great question. So I use this as a motivation graph, but to be honest, this is coming from the last part of the paper. So what you observe here is for the floaters, there's all the floaters that have happened since the 80s until 2016, I think. For the currency unions, the same thing. I use the Ilseski, Reinhardt, and Rogoff definition of what the exchange rate regime is. So those are ex post variations in exchange rates. It is true that, you know, in this currency, well, in the floaters, you basically have everyone that you could be thinking of. In the currency union, however, you do observe mostly developed economies that belong to the EU, to the Eurozone, and also sudden stops that have to do with a great financial crisis. There's a couple of episodes in the beginning of the 2000s, but there's not that many. So that's why in the final exercise in this, which I used to have at the very beginning of the paper, I look at the soft and the hard pegs. Because hard pegs is where you're going to see, you know, the developing economies, especially in Africa, that are pegged with each other. Or with some of the Latin American economies with the dollar at some points in time, and the kind of the takeaway is still going to hold. We're going to see that, you know, this decline is going to be larger and kind of better defined in terms of standard errors, the more you see this flexibility. So to your questions, yes, you're right, and it's fine. Like here, it's mostly developed economies in the great financial crisis. So there is a reason for concern, but when you go through the other intermediate cases, the pattern still holds, and there you do have developing economies in times where the great financial crisis was not the main shock.
And maybe you're going to tell us later, so then just feel free to push it off. But, you know, I'm sort of curious as to what happens to employment in these two episodes. Is this sort of like a trade-off between sort of, you can keep the people working, but they're going to be super unproductive. And then, you know, what currency is this productivity measured in? I'm presuming this is local currency, but, you know.
Yes, so on the employment, I'm going to show you the predictions of the model, which I don't have the actual data, but they're in online. So your kind of intuition is right. What we're going to observe, and just by the definition of the story that I'm telling, you're going to see that, you know, that the take on employment is going to be bigger in the currency union than in the floaters. In this kind of exercise, it's hard to tell. I mean, you do see differences, but just because the shock itself might not be comparable and there's no way I can control for that, it's difficult to say anything about whether those magnitudes are comparable or not. But in the model and in the Spanish case, you do observe that, you know, the increase in unemployment in the currency union is just far bigger because it's going to be a story about, you know, prices versus quantities. And the story that I have in mind also kind of, it's just that I'm going to kind of put less weight on the employment and focus more on the number of varieties or the firms in the market. But it's in I think it's the same story. It's just that the focus is going to be on different quantity. And the last thing was the how is this measured? That's a good question, and I should know this, but it's been a while. So I borrow this from the conference board, which uses national statistics mostly. So I think they're local currencies, but then they're probably converted into dollars. But yeah, it's been a while. I don't know. I don't remember exactly, but it's not a driver. Like the fact that the exchange rate is affecting, it's changing, it's depreciating in this case, does not mechanically generate this declining TFP, which I think it's the most important thing. Good. So in terms of the literature, let me just skip it in the interest of time, but there's like a bunch of international macro, especially topics where the paper would fit. Let me just emphasize that it's going to have and I guess this audience is great because of the combination of macro and trade. It's going to have a lot of a tradey flavor just because my model is going to be based on Melitz and Ottaviano. I'm going to just take this into a DSG setting. The reason I do this, or I started doing this, is because, you know, the shock that a sudden stop is going to generate is a real exchange rate depreciation, which you could potentially mimic through tariffs and subsidies. So there is going to be, like, you could potentially implement the same type of shock through a trade policy. And of course, you know, trade economists have really studied how there's regulate changes in trade policies affect productivity. So it's kind of a nice setup to start thinking about the questions that I have in the paper. Okay, so in terms of outline, I'm going to go through some firm level evidence and then go directly into the model. I'm not going to be super deep. I'm going to show you the parts of the model that are going to be relevant for the analytical results. But let me know if there's something which isn't clear. And then I'll tell you how far I am in taking the model to the data. And I probably skipped the aggregate evidence for today. So as I was saying, I was looking at what is the closest I could get to a perfect experiment where I have a sudden stop in two different economies, which are very similar, but only kind of different in the exchange rate regime. And the closest I could get is look for a country that has experienced two sudden stops under different regimes. There were a couple of candidates, Spain being one, but also Italy and Finland. All three kind of share these two different crises. One's the beginning of the 90s in the exchange rate mechanism crisis. The second one is in the late 2000s, the European surrender crisis. Spain, at the beginning of those two episodes, was in a similar condition in the sense that, you know, it was receiving massive capital inflows. It was running a current account deficit. In terms of competitiveness, it was doing very, very badly. Then there is something which is exogenous to the country's economy in terms of, like, you can describe both of them being driven by confidence shock to the European integration process. In the case of the exchange rate mechanism crisis, it's a referendum outcome in Denmark. In the European sovereign debt crisis, is obviously Greece admitting to have misreported the figures of public debt. And then the economy behaves very similarly in terms of, you know, there's a current account reversal. We see an increase in competitiveness, an increase in exports, decrease in imports. But exchange rate policy, of course, is very different because in the second episode, Spain was already in the currency union. So it had to go really painful wage devaluation. Whereas in the first episode, the country was not freely floating. It was managed, and what we observe is a number of depreciations being conducted by the central bank. So effectively, it behaved as a floater. Although in my first event study, it would not be classified as such because it was a managed floater. The data I'm going to be using is from this survey of business strategies, which is put together by a foundation that depends on the Ministry of Industry in Spain. It's around 1,800 firms in the Spanish manufacturing sector for like 1990 to 2015. There's two strengths, or there's two reasons why I use this survey as opposed to Orbis. The most important one is that it goes back to the early 90s. So that allows me to have this kind of counterfactual, what would a flexible exchange rate look like? The second one is that it's a survey that reports explicitly the causes of firm inactivity. So I can see when a firm stops collaborating. I can see when the firm is part of a merger and acquisition. I only want to call firm exit when a firm exits the market, not the survey. So that's why I'm pretty confident in what I'm calling firm exit over here. I do very little. I mean, this is a survey which is kind of put together for research purposes. So it's like extremely consistent. There's very little cleaning that I have to do. All I want to do is I want to estimate some firm level measure of productivity. I do that in a standard IO way by estimating revenue production functions. I use the Aggregate, Caves and Fraser, and then I do that at a 2-digit industry and calculate the firm level productivity as the solo residual of that revenue production function. What do I want to show you? So there's a bunch of different exercises that I do to just document this idea that in one episode we see unproductive firms exiting, and that mattering for aggregate productivity. So the couple of exercises I want to show you first is a growth decomposition, because of course when you think about unproductive exit, the first thing that comes to mind is that these firms tend to be really small. So when you do the numbers, you aggregate up, they tend not to matter. So that's the first thing that I need to do to convince you, which is, okay, let's get the firm level TFP, let's aggregate it up. First of all, show that it kind of builds up to a measure where there is a clear increase in the first episode, in the second episode, and a decline in the second one. And then let's go back into what is the contribution of the different types of firm. The first way I can kind of split it is between net entry and incumbents, where the sum of them has to add up to the total productivity growth. If we focus on the first episode, what I see is that, productivity growth, the decline in productivity that we observe is entirely driven by incumbents. So this is what a macroeconomist would expect. Now, there is a little bit of net entry, but it's so small relative to the incumbents that it really doesn't matter if you leave it out, because you're not going to mismatch. What's a little bit more surprising is if you look at the most recent episode, the increase, it is true that incumbents' contribution is positive, and that's something to keep in mind and explore a little bit further. But what's more important is that, 2/3 of the increase is actually driven by net entry, which is very, very surprising. We can go a little bit deeper in terms of the net entry and think about entrants and exiters. And comparing the two episodes, what we see is that the big difference has to do with exit. So entrants contribute negatively because they are on average less productive than incumbents. That's something that has been well documented in life cycle models of firms, and that holds for both episodes. In the case of exiters, they contribute positively because on average, they are less productive than incumbents. It's very, very surprising how big this number is. When you look a little bit deeper, I mean, I have the results somewhere else, but what you observe is that, you have much more exit, you have bigger exiters, and you have that on average, those exiters are much more productive. So all the different margins in which this exit contribution can be increasing are actually playing the role. So there's not just one single thing that's going on. It's not only more exit, but also we observe like bigger exiters than in regular times. But of course, if we have just more exit, that's just going to be a mechanical effect on productivity, and we cannot talk about a cleansing effect in its all, right? There has to be some reallocation, and the reallocation if anything, will show up in the incumbent part. So incumbents can be divided into two big contributions: the firm within firm, which is if you keep track of the productivity of the firm over time, and there is this is kind of what the standard models would tell you, is that at the firm level, productivity is counter-cyclical, so that during this recession, in both cases, it's declining. So this is kind of the way I view that. The sudden stop literature got it right, in that there is something going on to productivity, which we're not measuring, but it is kind of the same across the two episodes. The other two elements, which are going to look at the market shares and the growth of firm level productivity, have to do with the reallocation part of the incumbent contribution. And there we do observe that there's a difference in terms of the recent episodes. So this, the between firm and the cross term being positive and big enough to counteract the fact that at the firm level productivity is declining, is what's making incumbent being positive. So the takeaway here is essentially that there's massive exit of unproductive firms, and then some reallocation going back to productive survivors that's driving this positive productivity growth, despite the fact that at the firm level, productivity is declining in the same way that it was in the first episode. So that's kind of my claim of a cleansing effect of a recession. Of course, the cleansing effect of a recession can be tested in a more regression framework. Essentially, what the test is about is, what's the correlation between exit and previous period productivity, and whether this negative relationship with the firm dynamics literature would predict whether it is reinforced during the two sudden stops, right? So I just interact with dummies for the first sudden stop and the second sudden stop with productivity, and see whether this gamma and this theta are negative and significant. And what I find, non-surprisingly, given the decomposition, is that it's only significant, and economically the magnitudes are relevant in the case of the second episode. The reason this framework is useful, and it's not, even though it's repetitive, is because I can now control for a bunch of other difference across the two crises. So one thing that was already kind of let me just go on construction first. So one thing that's different is that in both episodes, Spain had its real estate bubble burst. And even though it happened in both episodes, it is much more starker in the second sudden stop. In terms of the magnitude, was just much bigger. So there is a question: to what extent was it driving the fact that we see massive exit? And if I control for that, this is manufacturing firms, so I don't have construction firms, but I can control for the using input-output tables, what is the exposure of the different sectors with respect to construction in the data, and controlling for that. There's still kind of a very significant strengthening of the correlation during the second episode. Other things that I can control for: the fact that the second episode was in the middle of the great financial crisis, so there is a banking crisis, maybe financial indicators were driving this. I control for, here I show you leverage, but I can control for liquidity, average cost of debt, anything that you consider is a good approximation for financial health. It's still a very kind of persistent coefficient. And I also control for the fact that intermediate inputs might be driving this, and I still find again that it keeps on going. So that's on the
two questions. Yeah. Sorry, one question. So this is like using all the full periods, the full set of the data. This paper by Lucas Karapawunas and co-authors, which sort of suggests the kind of an increase in misallocation associated with the capital inflows that precede the outflows. Is this sort of like the unwinding of that all of these crappy firms got, financing, and now you take it away, and then those crappy firms die? So they kind of had this slow productivity growth, and this maybe cleansing effect of this recession is sort of like an unwinding of that.
So there's let me just answer in different steps. So that's exactly a paper that got me studying this question, right? I was just curious on, is this just we're improving its allocation of capital? This is just like like the crisis is allowing for that. Let me just point out that the first thing is that this is not the data set that they use, and they do claim, and they're right, that because this data set has overrepresented big firms, they don't find those results using this data. That's why they use Orbis. However, that's not the main, so what I find is that there is no decline in the dispersion of marginal revenue product of capital, as opposed to just. Would you mind if I leave this question for the discussion?
Sure, no problem.
It's a very long answer.
Okay.
The short answer is that it's not exact. There's part of it going on, but it's not that what's driving these results.
So I had a second question, which is
sure.
Sort of, this kind of looks like you've got one recession that is a cleansing recession and one that is not a cleansing recession. I mean, how does this compare to kind of the standard of what recessions do in terms of, killing the bad firms and sort of reducing misallocation? Is this like a very different narrative, let's say, for the second episode, which is the more typical episode?
What I'm hoping to convey is that how policy response to a real exchange rate depreciation can shape whether it ends up being cleansing or not. So I'm going to try to, there's something particular about the sudden stop shocks, right? It is a type of a crisis in itself. So we don't have the data for the previous episodes, but there doesn't seem to be that is driving in the previous cases of sudden stop. So why is it, like what I'm trying to answer is why is it that this is prevalent now and not before? That's kind of what I'm trying to get at. Okay, let me just go directly into the basics. So I'm going to be writing up a small open economy model. And as I was saying, I'm going to be adding firm heterogeneity. I'm going to be basing it on Melitz and Ottaviano. I'll get to those nonlinear, quasi-linear quadratic preferences in a second and why they're useful for what I'm doing. But just as a teaser, it's going to be Melitz and Ottaviano. I'm going to stick for this analytical result, and this is one of the things that I'm going to be relaxing later on, to the idea that firms are going to draw some idiosyncratic productivity from a Pareto distribution, and it's going to be constant over time. So they draw it once, and it's going to remain unchanged forever. I'm going to allow for a little bit more of just to study how the concavity of the cost function affects. I'm going to allow for a unit cost of production that looks as follows. Although you can think about sigma, you can stick sigma equal to 1 and consider a linear production function in labor. As it's standard in trade, markets are going to be segmented. There's going to be an iceberg trade cost if you want to sell abroad, and the same thing for importers. And for this analytical version, I'm not going to allow for free entry. That means that there's going to be a constant potential number of entrants, which I'm kind of going to be noting by M and M star in the case of the foreign economy. And then these potential entrants are going to decide whether to produce or not. So there's going to be a margin of entry and exit. But there's not going to be a free entry condition that's going to pin down the number of potential entrants. We're just going to be pinning down the number of actual entrants. Again, this is one of the things that I'm relaxing later on. In terms of the nominal rigidities, I'm going to introduce them in the form of the weight setting process. That's because you'll see in a second that Melitz and Ottaviano is going to generate some choke prices. So if we have on top of that like sticky prices, it's going to be extremely messy. So I'm just going to assume like standard, labor is differentiated. There's different labor types that have some monopoly power on setting wages. For this analytical setting, the type of nominal rigidity that I'm going to be assuming is rational inattention. So sticky information, that's just because it makes the algebra much, much simpler, but everything goes through with like Calvo style with, costs of Rothenberg costs, anything like that is going to work. The only thing that doesn't work, and we can discuss that a little bit in the discussion part, is the Schmidt-Groh and Uribe downward nominal rigidity. That's not going to work, and I'm happy to discuss why. And then, policy is just going to be assumed that the central bank is going to control the nominal exchange rate. It can do whatever it wants with it. And the type of shock that I want to study in this analytical is just going to be a, unexpected one-time shock. So you can think about an MIT shock that's just one period to the real exchange rate. So there's not going to be autocorrelation coefficient. And the goal of this very simple model, or simpler model, is just to show you analytically how exchange rate policy is going to shape firm dynamics. So let me go directly into the consumer's problem. The consumer problem is going to be maximizing some utility function, which is going to be generating utility in the consumption of this differentiated good CT omega. And then I'm going to be thinking about the quasi-linear part, not as a non-tradable, which is what the original Melitz-Ottaviano paper does, but I'm going to introduce labor supply. So it's going to be leisure in the utility function. In terms of the quasi-linear quadratic preference, this kind of a functional form is going to allow for, this might be a little bit repetitive in this audience, but it allows for love of variety because it puts some weight gamma on the distribution of different varieties that it consumes. And the fact that it's quadratic is going to generate, as I'll show you in a second, a linear demand system and a choke price, which is going to allow for the entry and exit without needing a fixed production cost. But more importantly, for like the channels that I have in mind, is that it's also going to generate variable markups, and that's going to be key because it's going to allow for pro-competitive effects of any kind of shock. In terms of this kind of leisure part, it's going to be key that I introduce leisure because that's going to generate this idea of a demand shock or the income effect, depending on, some people like to think about it as demand, some people like income or wealth. It's going to be a mapping between how much you work and how much you consume. And it's going to be a substitution effect because it's quasi-linear, but it's still going to be some kind of relationship. It is not vital, but it's easier if it's linear, but I could have a disutility, a more standard kind of disutility functional form. The budget constraint is relatively standard for a small open economy. So I'm going to be allowed to borrow in international bonds. And this is because it's a small open economy, the interest rate is going to be taken to be fixed, or as it has to be a function. I'll get there in a second. And you can, the way that I'm writing this up is that instead of having a representative consumer and then different labor types that a union kind of puts together to decide on the wages, I'm going to assume that the household itself has the different labor types, and it's kind of maximizing with respect to all of them. The first kind of condition that's important is like, if you look at the first order condition with respect to consumption, we get, as I was saying, this linear demand system, whereby there is, we can define a choke price, which is the maximum price that a domestic consumer is willing to pay for any kind of good, let it be domestically produced or imports. And this is going to be very, very important in generating the results. The other kind of important condition is that, when you take the first order condition with respect to wages and also with respect to labor, you get this relationship between, the shadow price of income, which is the Lagrangian multiplier, and the wage that is being set. I'm going to be calling this the flexible wage because this is what, labor types would like to have if they were able to update their wages every single period. But I've just said that there's going to be nominal rigidities. I'm going to think of them as a fraction of this labor types are going to adjust their information set every period. So their wage decision is actually going to be a weighted average of what they expected future flexible wage to be in the past. The past expectations of future flexible wages. So this is kind of this is going to be a mapping between the actual wage, the ideal wage, and the Lagrangian multiplier or the shadow price. So this is what the leisure and the utility function is going to be buying me.
Hey, Laura, just a couple
Yes.
questions. Just at some point, you're going to map the model back to the data, and there's sort of two critical elements that are kind of missing that are important for Spain's experiences. Anytime you had like these current account reversals, you also had a rapid decline in investment, right? And so it's going to be really hard to match any movement. It's probably not appropriate to match the precise movements in the current account in this model without some version of investment. And then the second thing that's is kind of like a complementary thing is like people move around a ton in Spain. There's a massive outflow of people, particularly in the second in the Great Recession kind of one. And so both of those are going to somehow influence your results. Do you have any sense as to, are these just about like the GDP numbers as opposed to the productivity numbers?
So on the investments, on the numerical version that I'm going to show you, which is like what I completed and what I have in the paper as of now, I do have an extension where I include capital, but it is a numerical exercise. I didn't pay a lot of attention to like how well does the numbers do in the GDP, but I was trying to resist as much as I could include capital in the final model, but it's something that I think that when I go quantitative, when I want to match the data, when I want to match, what you were saying, the current account reversal, I'm gonna have to do it. So I haven't done it yet, at least in a proper quantified way, but I'm probably gonna go there. So that's a good point. On the moving around, I've had, I mean, maybe you made this question when I was on the market. So I've checked this, and the numbers, the official numbers and how many people left are very, very low. Surprisingly low. My bet and my personal experience, like myself, I was in London for 6-7 years doing my PhD. I was never registered as living abroad. So most people that left, they came back relatively quickly because it was like 1 year, 2 year period, and they never registered anyway. So it's hard to know how important this is in terms of the data, but I could explore with it a little bit more in terms of making the economy bigger or smaller in an exogenous way. And the Melitz and Ottaviano preferences is going to allow me to do that very easily. So yeah, I have no sense on how to match it, but I could play around with it.
I'll send you a citation as a reference on a paper that kind of closely matches it. Yeah.
Okay, great. That would be very helpful.
Thanks.
So the domestic, so the firm's problem is kind of very standard. Of course, you're going to have domestic production, you're going to have production of imports and the production of exports. As of now, like the one that's interesting for me is the domestic firms producing goods sold domestically, and you're going to have this function, right? As the demand, which is kind of what we derive from the consumer problem, and this relationship in terms of output and prices. The reason this is relevant is because when I want to solve the model, and the model, like as most trade models, they boil down to this one particular threshold. The one that I'm going to be focusing is in domestic production. What I'm going to be combining to get to this threshold is essentially the demand, the linear demand that I derive from the consumers, and also the production side from the firm. And here, what you see is that there's determining this threshold. There's going to be kind of two sources or two different channels. One is coming from the supply side, which is the nominal wage. If everything's cheaper, it's easier for you to be productive as a firm and therefore decide to stay in. The other one is coming from the demand side. And this is kind of the key contribution of the original Melitz and Ottaviano. So the way I read this is, Melitz, the original paper, was focusing on, what was happening in the labor market, and it was all about the cost channel. In the case of the Melitz and Ottaviano, they kind of have a partial equilibrium model where this is kind of no longer considered because they have the quasi-linearity, and they're focusing on what is demand and what is the effect of changes in the market structure on their demand for different consumption goods. So looking a little bit deeper into what is this choke price, as I was saying, I do get a very similar kind of description to what Melitz and Ottaviano, and like their whole story is about, when you have a larger number of competing firms, the market is tougher, then this maximum price that the consumer is willing to pay actually goes down. What I'm kind of adding by including leisure in the utility function is that now, the shadow price of income is also going to be playing a role. So if wages are connected to this, there's going to be a second round of effect of wages through the demand side that's going to be affecting the threshold. So that's kind of the point that I wanted to make. So if I were to linearize around some steady state just to see numbers, the formula is a little bit easier. You would have there's kind of three endogenous variables that are going to be affecting the threshold. And I think of them as different channels. The first one, Melitz and Ottaviano, pro-competitive, a number of competing firms is going to be affected. The second one is going to be the standard cost Melitz kind of effect, and what would be relatively new is this income or this demand or this is essentially still going to be wages, but it's going through total consumption. And like what's left here is just how does a real exchange rate depreciation affect each of these elements. And I'm going to be defining real exchange rates in a not very standard way. I'm going to be using the unit production cost. So it's going to be in terms of wages. And I'm going to, for this analytical example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to assume this is exogenous and just shock it. I'm just going to increase it exogenously. And what you can see
one
here,
question on that. Yeah. Should I think about this like as a terms of trade shock?
Yes, that could be. I mean, I had more of the back of my mind, what they have is a risk premium shock. And that's what I'm going to be kind of trying to map in the more quantitative. I've been playing around with just writing some very simple asset markets so that changes in the impatience of the foreign investor could generate this type of shock. So there's different ways of microfounding it. I still haven't, I'm still not married to any one of those different explanations. So, but yeah, in terms of trade, it's something it forces the terms of trade to change. That's kind of an equivalent way of looking at it. The one thing that's gonna, the way it's gonna affect market competitiveness, at least in the first round of effects, is that, you know, you're gonna have less importing firms. You know, if the competitiveness of the national economy increases, you're gonna have less guys getting in, selling their imports in the domestic market. Of course, this is again going to be affected. This is going to kind of build on NT, but NT and also depends on the cutoff, and the cutoff is going to start over here because there is a potential that, you know, if you still have, you know, you have less number of importing firms, but that means that you have like more room for domestic firms, it could go in the opposite direction. But at least in the most direct impact, you can think of a sudden stop or a real exchange rate depreciation as reducing the market competitiveness. How does it affect a shadow price of income? Well, it's going to be key. What's the relationship between the Lagrangian multiplier and wages? And this is where, you know, the nominal rigidities are entirely driving this whole thing. So the specification that I chose, I told you about, is the sticky information, just because it's a little bit more elegant, but this is going to hold for anything where, you know, you have a union setting wages, or you have like the consumer setting wages. It's not going to work for anything where wages are assumed to be exogenous for whatever reason. In this particular example, because you know this is a one-off shock, you can think of the change in the Lagrangian as being the negative of the change in the wages. What's going on here is, you know, the more the rigidity, so the smaller the number of labor types that are adjusting for a given overall change in the wage, it means that those labor types that are adjusting have to adjust by much more. So you're going to have a greater contraction of the shadow price of income. So that's how like the rigidity is going to build. It's going to amplify the effect on the consumer side. And the last part that's missing is what is the relationship between, you know, wages, the nominal exchange rate, and the real exchange rate. This is definition. The way I'm going to think about policy is that, you know, policy is effectively governing how the nominal exchange rate moves. So you could think of it as, you know, a Taylor rule with two different objectives, whereby one is keeping the exchange rate constant, which would be, you know, the definition of a currency union. What about the other extreme? You know, I've introduced one sort of rigidity and like inefficiency to be able to talk about policy, which is, you know, wages being sticky. So in the standard, more Keynesian kind of definition of what policy should do, well, policy should take care of that inefficiency that I've introduced. And the way that they would like to do that is by implementing the flexible price all over every single time. So that is essentially equivalent to having a zero wage inflation targeting, or trying to get the nominal wage to be constant at all times. Of course, this is not how most floaters actually behave, but it is true that if you look at data on like sudden stops in like especially the 2000s, what you would see is that there are measures in which, you know, the decline in the real exchange rate goes 80% on the nominal exchange rate and around 20% on prices or wages. So this is kind of what this phi W would be picking. I'm going to define monetary policy as deciding what is the mapping between the shock on the real exchange rate and how much of it is going through the nominal exchange rate versus the price, in this case, the wage. So in this kind of scenario, what you can do is if we go to the extremes, and of course take this just to explain how it works. If we look at floating, where it's entirely shutting down any movement in the nominal wage, then like the 2 and the 3rd channel are going to be kind of not working out, and it's only going to be the pro-competitiveness playing around. So it would be very clear that you have a decline in threshold. Whereas in a currency union, because you have the nominal exchange rate doing none of the work, it's not moving, it's going to, the adjustment that the real exchange rate is asking for is going to be entirely implemented through wages. So we're going to have the 3 channels, and it's going to be, a quantitative question, which one dominates. And in this very kind of analytical setting, it is very easy to see what are the sufficient conditions for which the threshold actually increases. And it has to do with, the shape parameter, which is going to tell you how strong the pro-competitive effect is, like how much competition there is going to determine whether, N has a bigger impact on total demand or not. Then, the measure of nominal rigidities, this is kind of regulating the mapping between wages and the shadow price of income. And then this labor share, which is the curvature of the cost function, which is essentially saying, once that you reduce wages, how much are you reducing the unit production cost by which? Okay, so this sort of model is going to be able to generate, differences in the aggregate productivity growth that are going to be entirely generated by net entry. So in terms of the table, like we're going to get the aggregate behavior right. We would have, in a currency union under the parameters that I've given you, which hold for most of the calibrations that you could come up with, you would see there's an increase in productivity in aggregate terms and a decrease if you were floating. And in the case of the currency union, this is going to be entirely driven by the net entry, and because you see a lot of exit. And then there is a little bit of reallocation, but there's no within effect. And for floaters, what we observe, which is a little bit counterfactual, is that you observe this decline in productivity growth. It's again driven by net entry, and it's actually because of the exit of unproductive firms. So the model does okay in explaining what's going on in the currency union. It does terrible in explaining what's happening to floating. And this is for 2 reasons. The first one is that if the way I've defined, with no free entry and with no and with the Pareto distribution, what ends up happening is that you either have entry or you either have exit. You cannot have both at the same time. So that is problematic. The other thing that's really important is that, I said at the very beginning, I'm going to stick to the idea that the firm level productivity is declining overall, at least at the firm level. So this is going to be like the intensive margin at play. I've not included that so far. And that is why, like, partly what's driving the negative productivity growth in the floaters is this entry of unproductive firms, which, I mean, we do observe a little bit in the data, but that's definitely not the main driver. So I'm not doing a good job in the floaters. I'm doing a relatively good job in the currency unions. The reason is because, currency unions is all about the composition. Floating, it's all about the intensive margin, which so far I didn't incorporate. So that's kind of one thing to keep in mind. So in terms of taking the model to the data, this is kind of the plan of this is what I'm working on. The first thing is, solving limitation 1. Remember, this is the idea that I don't have entry and exit at the same time. There's a number of ways. I'm going to basically stick this model in a more standard firm dynamics model. How to do that? First thing is I'm going to be introducing time-varying idiosyncratic productivity. So, and I'm gonna eliminate the fact that they follow, a Pareto distribution. So, and then I'm gonna allow for entry and exit. Exit is gonna be there's gonna be an exit value, which is gonna be positive and stochastic. The reason I include this in addition to the choke price is that I will be able to match the fact that exit rates are non-degenerate. So I don't see, a cutoff and anyone below, any firm below that exits and anyone above that. We do observe lower exit rates for more productive firms, but they're definitely not 0. So I want to be able to capture that gradualism. I can do that with a combination of the choke price and now this additional exit value, which is going to be positive and stochastic. And then I'm going to allow for entry, and I'm going to do this in a 2-step process following some of the papers on firm dynamics. So the idea is that you first have to pay a fixed cost to come up with the idea, and then you observe the quality of that idea and decide whether to enter or not. That's exactly where I was hoping to provide you the results today. I haven't been able to get them from the computer. But in order to solve the limitation too, that's much simpler. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to how, I don't know, the most standard papers, you know, like the ones that do not have financial frictions, how do they think about productivity, generating like this declining productivities, because they shift the exogenous part of productivity. So think about Mendoza 2010. That's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to think that firm productivity has, you know, this idiosyncratic component, which I've already described, but also a common component, which is going to be stochastic, and it's going to be part of the sudden stop shock in itself. So what the results that I have for today is, what if I, instead of, you know, doing this part that I'm working on, let me just solve the model that I already presented in you know, log linearizing perturbation methods. How far does that get me if I add the component? So this means like I'm going to be log linearizing. It's a small open economy, so I need to stationarize. This is something that I'm not going to be stick to in what's coming in the following version. But for now, I'm going to assume there's this dead elastic interest rate, so that the interest rate is a function of the world's interest rate, and that there is this component that ensures that debt is going to go back to some steady state by the end of any shock. And then there's going to be the risk country premium, which is what I'm going to assume the sudden stop is evolving. So this is stochastic, and this is exactly what's going to be shocked. And so now, like the experiment that I have for today is just an MIT shock, and it's going to be shocking at the same time the risk premium and the common productivity shifter. I'm going to be increasing the risk premium by 1 standard deviation. I'm going to be decreasing the productivity shifter by 1 standard deviation. How do I measure those things? How do I structure the shocks? And looking at, you know, the risk premium is just going to be the difference between the Spanish and the German 10-year government yield. For the common productivity shifter, it's a little bit more complicated, because I cannot go directly into the aggregate measures of productivity, because those are going to be, you know, subject to the compositional issues that I'm describing in the model. So what I do is I go to the firm level data, I identify a balanced sample of firms, and I try to look at the common productivity shifter as the average log productivity of those firms. So I'm trying to identify, you know, what is the within firm component. I find that, like, I do a VR, that those things they're non-correlated, so I'm just going to model as independent for now. And I'm just give a shot and, you know, calibrating parameters. This is numerical exercise, so I don't try extremely hard, but I put on numbers that are reasonable to some extent. I do, like, for some of the ones that are kind of unclear, what I look at is at the firm level moments, but I just look at impulse response functions to this shock. And what I wanted to show you essentially is that this is the impulse response function. This is how I look. This goes back to Dorian's question on employment. You see that, you know, for the currency union here in, this is the same. So this is the, let me just pause there because I'm going too quickly. So this is the economy calibrated to Spain in like the early 2000s. The experiment is, let me just shock it and simulate under currency union under floating. So here, what you would see is, you know, there is a clear decline in employment in the currency union in blue, and there's almost no movement in employment if you're in a floating. So how, like, what I hope to do when I get the quantitative model and when I incorporate all the bells and whistles that the firm dynamics is going to allow me, and maybe even capital, as suggested, is how does this compare to what we observe in the data? But I'm going to try to match what happens in the currency union and look at the floating as counterfactual. In terms of, okay, how does the table look like? How does this numerical exercise do once that I allow for this shifter? Does this improve in any way the results? So I'm still gonna have the issue of entry or exit. So we're still gonna have, you know, this non-available of the table at some point. But here we do kind of get a little bit closer in the sense that now in a currency union, you are generating this positive effect despite firm level productivity is falling because you have, exit of firms and reallocation of resources that's contributing and overcoming this negative effect. So overall, we see this increase in TFP. Where does the model take it wrong? There's a lot of reallocation here. I mean, in this model, think about anything that's freed up from the exiters immediately reallocated to the surviving firm. So this is obviously overestimating the measure of reallocation that we observe in the data. In the case of the floatings, now we get it right in that there is a declining productivity growth. It's entirely driven by the within component, because now if you look at net entry, there is some exit of unproductive firms, just as there is in the data, but it's just simply so small in terms of the magnitude that doesn't really compensate for the decline in the incumbents component. So this is to say that, a model of the intensive margin, like a standard macro model, is a good model for floaters, but you need this entry and exit margin in the currency union to generate this effect that the reallocation and the exit increases productivity through the net entry effect, despite the decline in the within firm component. So I'm going to skip the aggregate for now, unless the discussion shows up. And let me just conclude in time by kind of revising what I do, reviewing what I do. The idea is just basically going to this old question: how does exchange rate policy affect macroeconomic performance? This is a new attempt at an old question, emphasizing the role of firm dynamics. The motivation is this kind of surprising result of aggregate productivity going up after a sudden stop, but it actually is driven by the exit of unproductive firms. So a small open economy model, which features firm dynamics and nominal rigidities, it would be able to formalize the mechanism by which this can happen. And that's it for now.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Now we'll just open up the floor to any questions or comments. Just feel free to unmute and jump in.
So Laura, can you go back a couple slides for a second? Just in terms of like the model predictions to the impulse responses right there for a second. Like, yep. I mean, in the end, there's something that kind of doesn't feel right in terms of the real exchange rate moves more under the currency union than floating. Can you sort of speak to, I thought that was the thing we're trying to keep fixed. And what is it about the model that's allowing that to move around? I thought the policymaker was trying to stabilize that.
So there is a difference between the analytical model and the and this numerical model. In the analytical model, you're right, I shocked the real exchange rate. So if I were to plot that, I would have that both movements in the real exchange rate should be equal. What changes here is that I'm not shocking the real exchange rate, I'm shocking the interest rate. So whatever is going on in terms of the bond market could also be playing a role. So there is more like margins of adjustment. But I hear your point. I mean, I think that, so the current quantitative analysis that I have, I'm trying to look at I'm shocking the interest rate, but I am considering whether it would be better just to look at the, like, back up the interest rate shock that generates the observed increase in the real exchange rate. So that would be my moment to match in terms of the aggregate in terms of the transitional dynamics, as opposed to just considering, a given increase in the risk premium, because that's harder to measure in the data anyway. What is it generating this? So no, exchange rate policy is trying to decide, given the real exchange rate movement, how much is translated. So think about it, you can think of it as a pass-through from the real exchange rate into either nominal exchange rates or wages. That's what exchange rate is doing. So it's either stabilizing the nominal exchange rate or stabilizing nominal wages. The real exchange rate, it's not going to be stabilized.
Okay. I mean, the real exchange rate doesn't really move very much in the 2010 period. So it'd be nice to maybe think of a policy that puts weight on the real exchange rate instead of the nominal exchange rate or something, so you can kind of come a little bit more closer to what's going on. The other part is that the current account movements in the second recession are just, I know you're not really in a matching exercise, but the current account movements are just, orders of magnitude bigger. And here you've kind of got them going in other directions. So it'd be, I know you're still working on it. It'd be nice to kind of try to really line it up in terms of at least getting the real exchange rate right and the current account.
No, but this is super useful, because that's where, like, the feedback on what exactly would you like to see aligned, real exchange rates, that's on my mind, current account of, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Sort of following up from George's question, I sort of had the question of, to what extent is this really about sudden stops, or is this just about fixed versus floating? I in terms of, I prefer this setup of the model where it really looks like this risk premium shock. It seems kind of, I kind of don't know how to think about that other shock that you had in the stylized model. But, what makes this sudden stops rather than, this is episodes where something happens in international financial markets and how that gets transmitted to the local market, a shock that originates either because we suddenly think that you're a crappy borrower and our view of you changes, or just there's something about risk appetite in the world at large. And I just didn't have a good sense of.
You're definitely, so that's definitely a good point, and you're right. There's nothing in the model that makes. Well, let me take that back. So the first answer is, the reason I focused originally on sudden stop is when I think about the aggregate data, which is how I started. It's a very well identified shock. So like, I don't have, I could have these event studies. I could look, I had a very clear set of episodes I could compare, and I could get some, aggregate predictions on the data. But it is true that when I go to the data, to the model in itself, there's nothing strictly, there's nothing about sudden stops in themselves, with a caveat. I think the fact that I need to shock TFP simultaneously, because remember, like, I'm shocking the risk premium, but I'm also shocking the common component of productivity, which is, like how the standard, like if you think about the Mendoza's 2010 paper, he essentially has 3 shocks at the same time to be able to describe it as a sudden stop. So I do think that in that sense, it might be a little bit special. If you're happy calling, a shock to the international financial markets that has some implications on aggregate productivity that we're not able to microfound. I mean, if you were to introduce this in a financial frictions model, you would be able to generate the aggregate part without needing to shock the TFP. So in that sense, yes, you could think of other interpretations of what the model is, of the shock is, that are not necessarily termed as a sudden stop. I also have the feeling that since the European, so when I started this project, my first couple of presentations, I would have to convince people that, what happened in Europe was a sudden stop. Like a year later, that was kind of common knowledge, and like people would say, why do you spend 2 slides discussing this as a sudden stop? So my feeling is that what we defined a sudden stop to be has also evolved over time. So I think now it's closer to what you're describing of something happens in international financial markets that change the way investors feel a particular country, and has nothing to do with the structure of the country per se, than anything more specific. That's kind of the shock that I would be interested in. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm just, trying to get a sense of, you seem to be at a stage where you're trying to reorient the paper and rewrite it. What would be the best, it can't be a paper about everything. What is it? How is it best to focus this? What is the question to which your paper is going to be the answer? And, I'm trying to get a good sense of what would be the best way to orient it. I mean, related to that, I had the question of, okay, so you don't talk about welfare, and often when people talk about fixed versus floating, they're talking about welfare. You're focusing on more sort of an empirical question, the behavior of productivity. So there's kind of like, do you need a model with firm dynamics to explain the behavior of productivity in sudden stop episodes? That's sort of one question that I have. And two, would the welfare consequences of a choice to fix or float be any different in a model with firm dynamics, which can match those things, or a model without firm dynamics, which might not be able to match those things? That's sort of a question that I had.
Okay, so on the welfare question, I did have a welfare section on it. And on this kind of numerical version, so it was not on the quantitative exercise, right? So there were interesting kind of predictions in which where exactly, like what is the level of, I could basically calculate what's the level of flexibility that is optimal. That's the way I would kind of tackle that question. It was somewhere in between the flexible and the currency union, which I think it's an interesting result. What made it extremely controversial is the fact that, I'm including leisure in the utility function. So in the currency union, you see this increase in this decline in employment, which from the lenses of the model, it increases utility. So I did have, back and forth, and okay, let me just think about not a utility-based welfare measure, but instead, let me just look at consumption, aggregate consumption, and whether this results. And there were still things that were interesting, but I got a lot of angry people, either first of all, because some people are very committed to, if you're sticking to a model, then that's the welfare measure you should be using, whereas some other people were more sensitive to, Spain had a huge unemployment during the Great Reset, during the European sovereign debt crisis. Telling people that was good for them would be very, very problematic. So that's why I stayed away. But I've done the exercises. What I didn't do, which I think it's a good point, is, or I did. Yes, I did. So I remember I would start the presentation with a version of the welfare result in my model versus what I call the Friedman view of the model, which is just shutting down the firm dynamics. And with the Friedman view, you would always prefer a flexible exchange rate, whereas in in this model, it would be depending on a number of parameters, and it would be you could see where's the intersection in terms of the phi W, which is the weight that you put in I think exchange rate stabilization. So it was not entirely, because the optimal was at some point between 0 and 1, you would have this intercept. So yes, I've done that exercise. Yeah, I decided to stay away because there was already a lot of stuff on the plate in terms of the paper. And there is a question on how to measure welfare in this kind of model. I think from a trade point of view, where you're kind of avoiding leisure in the utility function, it's just much more straightforward. So I'm kind of building on them, but wanted to do something more with the labor supply that's messing up the interpretation of welfare. And you had another question that's a good point on what is the question that I would like to answer. I mean, the model I have, like the question that I have in mind is, if you need this increased competitiveness, which is essentially an increase in the real interest rate, how does policy respond to that? And how does that affect aggregate variables? That's kind of the question that I have. So I'm trying to link, what is the real exchange rate shock to something that we observe in the data, like this. That's exactly how you would label, right? A shock in the first place.
I'm still a bit confused about the question. I think that's sort of like the main thing that you need to get right. And then everything of what you should do after that will follow from, getting that sorted out. It just becomes hard to decide what to put in when you don't know what question it is that you're answering.
Fair.
So can I ask a question? Everyone's smiling. I'm zoomed out, man. This is my third Zoom seminar today. This is like Dorian skipped out on the big one today. What about intermediates? I don't know. I didn't see the you went through the TFP measure like really quickly. The reason why I bring it up is like, if you think about the way these models work, trade models. Like, so Mellitz is like, wants to be about reallocation, but there's really no reallocation because the value of marginal product is always equated. And then Ottaviano is all about reallocation. There's nothing within firm. And then kind of the striking thing is you see the way that within firm component is coming. And, you know, one way to get at the within firm component moving around is with intermediates. And so I was wondering, like, do you have that in the data, or have you thought of that as like a mechanism through which to generate movements in the within firm component in the quantitative part?
So on the data, the only thing I observe is whether the firm is an importer or not. So that's what I try to control for in the regression analysis. I do not observe like what share of it goes into, you know, it's an intermediate good, or like it's a 1-0, it's a dummy essentially. So that there's very little I can do in that sense. In terms of moving forward, in the current version, I do have an extension with intermediate inputs, so that there's this, you know, there's this expenditure switching within the firm going on. It doesn't change the prediction. So like in the numerical example, it still goes through. And I plan that's still going to be on the comparative model, because I think it's a different channel. I think it's complementary, but it is important to just be able to test it against the economic significance of the one that I'm proposing, just to see how, you know, is it as relevant or not. But yeah, the data in that sense, I think that's I was very excited at the beginning because I thought, you know, it had trade data, but in the case of the intermediate inputs, it's just whether it's a yes or a no. So there's very little I can do apart from just controlling on who is an importer or not, in terms of are these guys driving the results. It also tends to happen. I mean, if you look at who these guys are, they tend to be the most, like, they're people who are engaged in trade anyway. So it tends to be exporters at the same time. And they tend to be the most productive. So they are not the people that are disappearing from my sample anyway. And I guess I left the question on the Gopinath paper unanswered. So this is something I've explored. I tried to look at, it's again also a very controversial thing to put on the paper. Essentially, I did the exercise with the data. So the first thing I did is I weighted the data in a way using. I mean, they do provide weights so that I could put more weights on the smaller firms relative to the baseline, and that would allow me get their results for the pre-crisis episode. I could generate the results that they have in Orbis using this data set. And then with that subsample, with that weighted sample, I would go on and see whether there's been a reversion of the dispersions. And what you see is that, yes, you see that, you know, the dispersion in the marginal revenue product of capital falls, but you see the same thing happening in the marginal revenue product of labor. So if you were to interpret that from like a Sheehan-Clinault point of view, what you would observe, it's the output misallocation that would be affected. It's not the capital labor ratio, which is the one that they hypothesize. So that is consistent with the idea of markups changing, and that's something that, you know, the model kind of predicts, and it's in a sense a little bit of the reallocation that you observe when the exit margin happens. So it is like we're back to a better or a smaller misallocation, but it's not misallocation of capital only. It's just misallocation of both capital and labor. The other thing that I do is, just because, of course, there is this representative issue, I redo the exercise with Orbis, and I get the same results for the second period, but I cannot compare it to the earlier period because Orbis starts in the beginning of the 2000s. So yeah, so there is a continuation, but it's not only on the capital side, which also kind of makes sense, because when I do control for, you know, the financial situation of firms, I do not observe that the effect disappears. So there has to be something more than just access to credit. But yeah, I mean, when I thought that was gonna, like, when I started working with this data, I thought this is exactly what I'm gonna find. Is, you know, like, there's undoing of the misallocation of capital. Still, this is something that, because it's not the same data set, I cannot like very seriously address.
Thanks.
Okay, cool. George,